September 12, 1963. The Syria Mosque Theater, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. 9:43 p.m. Dean Martin was halfway through Ain't That a Kick in the Head when he heard it. A voice from the upper balcony, loud, drunk, mocking. "Hey, Dino, remember me?" "Still pretending you're better than everyone else?" The audience gasped. Security started moving toward the heckler. The band kept playing, but Dean had stopped singing. He stood at the microphone staring up into the darkness of the balcony, his face completely white. The voice continued. "Yeah, it's me, Vince Carlucci. We went to high school together, remember? When you were just a greasy wop who couldn't speak English." The entire theater went silent. This wasn't just a drunk heckler, this was something else. Something personal, something that had been waiting 30 years to surface. Dean Martin set down his microphone, walked to the edge of the stage, and said 4 words that nobody in that theater would ever forget. "Vince, come down here." What happened in the next 11 minutes would reveal more about Dean Martin than any interview ever could. This is the story of a wound that never healed, and the moment Dean Martin finally stopped running from his past. You think you know Dean Martin's origin story? Poor Italian kid makes good, classic American dream. You don't know the half of it. Because the story Dean told in interviews was sanitized, polished, safe for public consumption. The real story, the one about violence and humiliation and a boy who learned that survival meant erasing who you were, that story never made it to TV. Until September 12th, 1963. Until Vince Carlucci showed up drunk in a Pittsburgh theater and forced Dean to confront the past he'd spent 30 years trying to forget. This is about what happens when you bury trauma instead of healing it. About the price of assimilation. About a boy named Dino Crocetti, who became Dean Martin by killing off pieces of himself. And about the moment when the ghost of that boy came back to haunt him. This is the story of the night Dean Martin stopped pretending, and what it cost him. Let's go back to Steubenville, Ohio, 1930. Dino Crocetti was 13 years old. He spoke Italian at home because his parents, Gaetano and Angela, barely spoke English. When Dino started at Grant Junior High School, he could barely communicate with his teachers or classmates. He'd try to answer questions in broken English, and the other kids would laugh. The teachers would get frustrated. "Speak properly, Dino. This is America. We speak English here." Dino wasn't stupid. He was bright, actually. But when you can't express yourself in the language everyone else is using, people assume you're slow. They treat you like you're less than. And in 1930s Ohio, if you were Italian, you were already considered less than. The slurs were constant. Wop, Dago, Greaser, Guinea. Dino heard them every single day, from classmates, from teachers, from shopkeepers, from cops. Being Italian in Depression-era America meant you were one step above black people in the social hierarchy. Which is to say, not much. You were suspected of being criminals, mob-connected, dirty, untrustworthy. Dino's father worked 16-hour days in a barber shop to feed his family. Dino's mother scrubbed clothes until her hands bled. They were the hardest-working people Dino knew, but to their neighbors they were just wops, just immigrants who didn't belong. Vince Carlucci was the son of the police chief, Italian too, but third generation. His family had anglicized their name from Carluccio to Carlucci, spoke perfect English, and made a point of being more American than the Americans. Vince was big for his age, athletic, popular, and he hated Dino Crocetti, not for any rational reason, but because Dino represented everything Vince's family was trying to distance themselves from: the broken English, the poverty, the old country ways. Dino was a reminder that no matter how hard you tried to assimilate, people would still see you as foreign, as other. And Vince dealt with that discomfort by making Dino's life hell. It started with verbal harassment. Vince would mock Dino's accent in front of other students, would make exaggerated gestures and speak in fake Italian. Mamma mia, spicy meatball. The other kids would laugh. Dino would keep his head down and say nothing, because what could he say? His English wasn't good enough to defend himself, and even if it was, fighting back meant getting beaten up or expelled. So Dino learned to be invisible, to stay quiet, to survive by not being noticed. But Vince wouldn't let him be invisible. One day, in October 1930, Vince cornered Dino in the locker room after gym class. "You know what your problem is, Crocetti? You don't belong here. You and your whole family should go back to Italy where you came from." Dino tried to walk away. Vince grabbed him by the shirt and slammed him against the lockers. "I'm talking to you, greaseball. You think you're going to ignore me?" Dino finally snapped. He shoved Vince back, hard. Vince stumbled, shocked. Then his face twisted with rage. He charged at Dino and beat him unconscious. When Dino woke up, he was in the nurse's office. His face was swollen. His ribs were cracked. The principal was there. He looked at Dino with barely concealed disgust. "Fighting is grounds for expulsion, Dino. We don't tolerate violence." Dino tried to explain. He started it. "He's been harassing me for months." The principal cut him off. "Mr. Carlucci says you attacked him first, and, frankly, given your family's background, I'm inclined to believe him." Dino's heart sank. He understood. Vince's father was the police chief. Dino's father was a barber. There was no version of this story where Dino won. He was suspended for 2 weeks. When he came back, he kept his head down even more, spoke even less, made himself even smaller. But the damage was done. Dino Crocetti learned a crucial lesson that day. Being yourself was dangerous. Speaking your language was dangerous. Being proud of your heritage was dangerous. If you wanted to survive, you had to erase yourself, become what they wanted you to be. A year later, Dino dropped out of school. He started working in steel mills and coal mines. He dealt blackjack in illegal gambling dens. He boxed for money. And slowly, painfully, he taught himself English. Real English. Not the broken, halting English of his parents, but smooth, accentless American English. He listened to radio announcers and copied their cadence. He watched movies and mimicked the actors. He trained himself to sound like he'd been born in America, like he belonged. By the time Dino was 20, you couldn't tell he'd ever spoken Italian. He'd erased his accent completely, erased his past, erased Dino Crocetti. In 1941, when he started performing professionally, he changed his name to Dean Martin. American. Simple, safe. No hint of Italy. No reminder of the boy who'd been beaten up for being a wop. Dean Martin became everything Dino Crocetti couldn't be. Confident, cool, untouchable. But underneath, the wound never healed, the shame never went away. Dean spent his entire life running from the boy who'd been humiliated for speaking the wrong language. 30 years later, Dean Martin was one of the most famous men in America. He'd made millions. He'd starred in movies with Elizabeth Taylor and Marlon Brando. He performed for presidents. He was living proof that you could escape poverty, escape prejudice, escape your past. Except you can't. Not really. Because your past doesn't disappear. It just waits. And on September 12, 1963, Dean's past showed up drunk in a Pittsburgh theater. When Dean heard Vince Carlucci's voice, he didn't just hear a heckler. He heard every slur he'd ever endured, every beating, every moment he'd been told he didn't belong, every time he'd had to make himself smaller to survive. The trauma of 30 years came rushing back in an instant. The band had stopped playing, the audience was frozen, security was moving toward Vince. But Dean held up his hand. Stop. Let him talk. Vince Carlucci stumbled down from the balcony. He was drunk, overweight, clearly struggling. He made his way to the front of the stage and looked up at Dean with bleary, defiant eyes. So you made it, huh, Dino? Big shot now. Too good to remember where you came from. Dean Sheen's voice was calm, dangerously calm. I remember exactly where I came from, Vince. Do you? Vince laughed bitterly. Yeah, I remember. I remember you couldn't even speak English. I remember you were nothing. And now, look at you, pretending to be something you're not. Dean stepped down from the stage. He was inches from Vince now. The entire theater held its breath. You're right, Dean said quietly. I did pretend. For 30 years I pretended that what you did to me didn't matter, that the beatings and the slurs and the humiliation didn't leave scars. I pretended that changing my name and my accent and my entire identity was a choice. But it wasn't a choice, Vince. It was survival. Because people like you made it clear that being Dino Crocetti was dangerous. Vince's bravado faltered. I was just a kid. We were all kids. Dean's eyes were cold. You beat me unconscious, Vince. You mocked me for speaking my parents' language. You made me hate myself for being Italian, and when I fought back, the system protected you and punished me. Because your father was the police chief and mine was a barber, that's not kids being kids. That's cruelty, and it shaped my entire life. The audience was silent. Some were crying. Vince looked down at his feet, unable to meet Dean's eyes. I'm sorry, Vince muttered. I was angry. My family. We were trying so hard to fit in, and you reminded us of everything we were running from. Dean's expression softened slightly. I know. I understand that now. You hated me because you hated the part of yourself that was still Italian, the part that would never be fully American no matter how hard you tried. We were both victims of the same system, Vince, but I didn't beat you up for it. Vince looked up, tears streaming down his face. I ruined your childhood. Dean shook his head. No, you taught me something important. You taught me that I had to hide to survive, that the world wouldn't accept me as I was, and I spent 30 years proving you right. I erased Dino Crocetti. I became Dean Martin, smooth, cool, American. And I was so good at it that people forgot I was ever that scared Italian kid, but I never forgot. Every time I looked in the mirror, I saw him. The boy you beat up, the boy who learned that being himself was dangerous. The audience was completely silent. Dean turned to face them. His voice was louder now, addressing everyone. You want to know why I never talk about my childhood? Why I never mention being Italian in interviews? Because I learned early that being ethnic was a liability, that having an accent made you a target, that the only way to succeed in America was to erase everything that made you different, so I did. I became the guy who looked white enough, sounded American enough, acted cool enough. And it worked. I became a star. But I lost myself in the process. Dean turned back to Vince. So, yeah, I remember you, Vince. I think about you every time I introduce myself as Dean Martin instead of Dino Crocetti. Every time I hide my heritage. Every time I pretend that I don't remember what it felt like to be humiliated for speaking Italian. You live in my head, Vince. You've been there for 30 years. Vince was sobbing now. "I'm so sorry, Dino. I didn't know. I didn't understand what I was doing." Dean looked at him for a long moment. Then he did something nobody expected. He extended his hand. "I forgive you, Vince. Not because what you did was okay, but because holding on to this anger has been eating me alive for 3 decades. I need to let it go. Not for you, for me." Vince took Dean's hand, shaking uncontrollably. They stood there for a moment, the bully and the victim, 30 years later. Both broken by the same system that demanded they erase themselves to belong. Then Dean pulled Vince into a hug. The audience erupted in applause, but Dean wasn't doing it for them. He was doing it for 13-year-old Dino Crocetti, the boy who'd been beaten up and told he didn't belong, the boy who'd spent 30 years hiding in shame. Dean was finally telling that boy, "It's okay. You can stop hiding now." After the show, Dean and Vince sat in Dean's dressing room for 2 hours. They talked about Steubenville, about what it was like growing up Italian in a town that hated immigrants, about the pressure to assimilate, about the price of survival. Vince told Dean about his own struggles, how his family had pushed him to be more American, how he'd joined the army to prove his patriotism, how he'd spent his whole life trying to distance himself from his heritage and ended up miserable, divorced, and alcoholic. Dean listened without judgment. Then he said, "We both lost, Vince. We both sacrificed who we were to become who we thought we needed to be. And neither of us ended up happy." When they finally parted, Dean gave Vince his phone number. "If you ever need help, you call me, okay?" Vince nodded, too emotional to speak. That night, Dean couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about that confrontation, about how much of his life had been shaped by shame, by the belief that being Dino Crocetti wasn't enough, by the desperate need to prove he belonged. The next morning, Dean made a decision. He called his manager and said, "I want to do something different. I want to start talking about being Italian. I want to acknowledge my heritage. I want to stop hiding." His manager was skeptical. "Dean, that could hurt your image. Americans like you because you're universal." Dean cut him off. "I'm Italian, Tom. My parents were immigrants. I spoke Italian before I spoke English, and I'm done pretending that's something to be ashamed of." In the months following that Pittsburgh concert, Dean Martin slowly started reclaiming Dino Crocetti. He started incorporating Italian songs into his performances. He talked about his parents in interviews. He visited Steubenville and spoke openly about his childhood, the poverty, the prejudice, the pressure to assimilate. He wasn't angry. He was honest. And something unexpected happened. His audience loved it, because vulnerability is more powerful than coolness. Authenticity is more compelling than perfection. People didn't want Dean Martin, the untouchable star. They wanted Dino Crocetti, the survivor, the man who'd overcome shame and prejudice and trauma, the man who'd finally stopped running from his past. Dean never saw Vince Carlucci again, but he heard that Vince got sober, that he reconciled with his estranged daughter, that he started volunteering with immigrant families, teaching English to new arrivals and making sure they didn't feel the shame he'd felt growing up. It wasn't redemption, but it was healing. In 1995, 2 months before Dean died, his daughter Deanna asked him, "Dad, what's the moment you're most proud of in your career?" Dean thought for a long time. Then he said, "September 12th, 1963, Pittsburgh. When I finally stopped being afraid of who I used to be." That night, I wasn't Dean Martin. I was Dino Crocetti, and it was the first time in 30 years that I felt like myself. So the next time you see Dean Martin on stage, Smooth, cool, effortlessly American, remember that he wasn't born that way. He built that persona brick by brick, hiding the scared Italian kid underneath. He spent decades running from Dino Crocetti because he believed that boy was shameful, unworthy, unlovable. But on September 12, 1963, in a theater in Pittsburgh, Dean Martin stopped running. He confronted his past. He forgave his bully, and most importantly, he forgave himself. For changing his name, for erasing his accent, for hiding his heritage. He finally understood that survival isn't the same as surrender, that adapting isn't the same as erasing, that you can become someone new without killing who you were. This is the story they don't tell in the Hollywood documentaries, the story of a boy beaten up for being Italian. The story of a man who spent 30 years hiding in shame. The story of a confrontation that forced him to finally face the truth. You can't run from yourself forever. Eventually, your past catches up. And when it does, you have a choice. You can keep hiding. Or you can finally stop pretending. Dean Martin chose to stop. And in that moment, he became more than the king of cool. He became Dino Crocetti again. Scared, flawed, human, real. And that was the bravest performance he ever gave.